Good morning, all, and Happy New Year. I came to New Mexico in 2008 when I bought a company here, a company that's today Curia. It was called OsoBio back in those days. It was the second largest manufacturing company in the state. It was failing, not doing well at all. It hadn't made money in a decade. So the big national company that owned it was getting rid of it. I came along and bought it. We were able to turn it around and make a profit in the second year. A couple years later, we were able to sell it to a big national company, which is now Curia. That was a time when I had the option to leave, go back somewhere. I've actually lived in 6 states and also in Puerto Rico and in Russia. So I could have gone lots of different places, but I decided I was going to stay here. And the reason I decided to stay here is because I had looked around and I saw this massive amount of technology that was coming out of national labs and that was coming out of our 3 research university systems. And I saw the potential of using that as a base for economic development, that technology. And so I started initially the BioScience Center. My background was in pharmaceuticals and biotechnology. When I started the BioScience Center, as Lisa said, we opened it, we bought it, the building in 2012, we renovated it. It was filled very rapidly, and except during COVID period, it has remained at 100% occupancy. So that we're now at a point where we're looking at creating a second one. The demand is huge in startup world. But back when I started this in the 2012-13 period, and you were a startup, where could you get capital? How do I do this? How do I do this? There we are. Okay, so back in 2012, it was the New Mexico Angels. That's what you saw. That's where the money was. There were a few spotty investors around who might do more than what the angel groups could do. But the angels back in those days were basically a group of people. You would pitch to them, and then each individual would decide on their own, are they going to invest? And they would typically invest between $10,000 and $25,000 each. What that meant is if you were trying to raise capital, you could probably get $150,000, in rare cases $250,000, and then you'd use it up, and it was hard to find the next wave of capital that you needed. Okay? And so a lot of those companies that were startups left the state because they could get funding elsewhere. Things started to change in the next 4 or 5 year period. Okay, our federal legislators, our state legislators started putting pressure on all the university systems and on the national labs to become much more aggressive in out-licensing. And at the same time, or right thereafter, the state created the Catalyst Fund. And the Catalyst Fund created money, supplied money with match that allowed micro venture capital firms to be created. And those micro venture capital firms have been the catalyst fund, the catalyst for stimulating this huge wave of startups that we have today. We're still lacking when you need more than $2 million, but that first million, from what I hear from my friends in San Diego and Boston and other places, that first million that you need is actually easier to get today in New Mexico than it is in almost any other place. We still struggle for the 2 million and more, but that first wave is here and it's available. It's hard sell, but you can get it. What's happening now in this recent period is the State Investment Council has started to invest in large VCs, putting 10 million and more into large venture capital firms that are required to deploy that capital in New Mexico. We haven't seen a lot of deployment yet, but it's coming. They're scouting and they're investigating. So these are a list of investors who have received money from the state. It's a huge wave, and I apologize in advance as I was manipulating my PowerPoint. I somehow deleted 110 Capital. So 110 Capital should be in this on this slide as well. But there are now lots of firms who have money and are looking and are required to invest it in New Mexico. There's money available. If anyone wants more detail about any of these companies, I have where they specialize, and I have their websites and maybe email addresses. So someone should contact me if you have any interest in getting more detail about any of these companies. But it's not only the investment firms that have taken state money. There are others. These are companies that have raised capital on their own and are deploying it in New Mexico. And there may be others. I've done the best I could in trying to put together this table, but I may well have missed many. Now, I want you to think about, it's doing it on its own. Okay. I've done some research on my own. It may not be completely accurate, but it's really interesting. In 2021, the last year I was able to get data, New Mexico spent $9.1 million in R&D. Okay? What's the significance of that number? 9.1 million in the absence of references doesn't mean a lot. Well, number one in the country was Silicon Valley at about 48 billion. But then it drops precipitously. Okay? And when it drops precipitously means number two was the Boston area at about 24. And then there are a bunch of regions that drop into the 14 to 18 range. Okay? At 9.1, where are we? Top 10, my best estimate. 9 or 10, maybe 11, but somewhere in that range. But we're different than the others because in New Mexico, virtually all of this 9.1 was government-funded R&D, mostly from the federal government. Is that good or bad? Well, frankly, where we are in our evolution, I think it's good because with the money being supplied by the government, it's not proprietary. Almost all of it is available for out-licensing. And what that means is these technologies that develop from this kind of R&D funding can lead to startups. People with new technologies that can develop and evolve. You can license these technologies from the national labs and the research universities. Okay. We're spewing out R&D, intellectual property, at ultra high rates in a number of fields. Space technologies. We all hear about the Space Valley. It's booming. Energy technology, battery technology. Got a number of startups evolving in these technology in these areas. The biosciences, there are major companies evolving now that are going to have dramatic global impact with what they're developing, with their starts having been in New Mexico. Agricultural technologies as well. These are the hard tech startups that will create clusters in New Mexico. Clusters in these areas are what are going to drive economic performance over the long haul. Think for a moment about Singapore and Israel. These are economic powerhouses today. How did they get started? They got started with small companies, largely funded by the government and with strong support from government, both with money and other support. Singapore and Israel developed their entrepreneurial ecosystems to the point where they became globally visible. And big companies, the Intels of the world and so on, the Microsofts of the world, said, we need to be there. That very same thing can happen in New Mexico. The key is developing our entrepreneurial ecosystem. Who creates jobs? President Stokes mentioned it briefly. If you look at the statistics, 100% of net new jobs globally, not only in the United States, are created by small companies and startups. 100%. Big companies do not create new jobs. Yet in economic development, virtually every state focuses on trying to attract big companies to their state to invest capital, okay, and hire people. That's because it's easy to do politically. It gets you big points. You've attracted a big company. Reality is it doesn't change your dynamic at all, because big companies are expensive to attract. You have to pay a lot to get them to come, and you end up having to pay a lot to keep them. It's much cheaper, much, much cheaper to grow your own. If we spent half the amount we currently spend on attracting companies from out of state and instead put that money into the local startup scene, we would see 3 to 5 times the number of new jobs created. And there are strong national statistics to support what I just said. That we put, in other words, economic development, my view, and view of many others, is that you need to grow your own. And you can supplement it with trying to attract out people from other places. But they'll come on their own once you have the ecosystem in place. On again. Sorry for this. Stop. Okay. I want to talk about another angle on economic development. You take a look at the demographics of New Mexico. Approximately 40% of our population is at the poverty level or below. Think about our rankings. We see things in all the time that come out in the paper that say we're ranked 48 or ranked 50. Or we're ranked very low in lots of different categories. Why is that? My opinion is that it's because the 40% drag down all the averages. If we look at the 60%, my own estimate's very rough. If we look at the 60% instead of the 40%, we'll find that we're doing well. In the same categories where we're ranked between 48 and 50, we'd be ranked between 5 and 20 in most everything. The bottom line is the 40% drains resources, and the problem is we treat this as a social problem and not an economic development problem. The reality is if we focused on the 40% as an opportunity for economic development, we could have a dramatic impact on the image and reputation within the state. But what we do instead is the 40% get trapped in their environment. We help them survive. We make food accessible. We make housing accessible to some limited degree. Costs a lot of money to do that. The people who are receiving those benefits end up getting trapped in the system. They have no way to get out of it. And so we never change that 40%. That 40% at the poverty level has been in place in New Mexico for decades, despite dramatic efforts to change it. The people get confined in their environment and can't escape it. There are, of course, exceptions, but not enough. A very interesting statistic, two statistics, really. One is that 1/3 of all immigrants nationally, this is in the US, start new businesses. But they get help in starting new businesses, often from their friends and neighbors and family. 60% of Fortune 500 companies were started by immigrants. So what are we doing to address this? Well, we've been doing lots of things for lots of years. We keep doing the same thing over and over again. Maybe we need to change what we're doing. Try something that's not proven. Try something different. What could that be? How about taking the immigrants, taking the Native Americans, taking those in the 40%, and focus on entrepreneurship. Give these people training to start their own business. Maybe it's a bodega. Maybe they have plumbing skills and you can teach them to run their own business instead of being employed by someone else. Maybe they start a restaurant. But right now, these people are ignored and intentionally ignored by the system that enables the financing and development of these kind of companies. If you're a minority, if you're a female, you have much more struggle trying to raise capital than others. If we want to really change the economy of New Mexico, we need to focus on assisting this level of person, the people who are at the poverty level and below. Doesn't mean we should change what we do for the 60%, the funding for the startups with new technologies. But we need to focus on the 40% by teaching them technical skills if they don't have them, by teaching them business skills, and giving them low interest loans and mentors. Mentoring is a key component. Look at the successes. Some of you may be aware of what New Mexico Community Capital has done through its Native Entrepreneur in Residence program, taking novice Native Americans and teaching them to be entrepreneurs, a program that started back around, I don't know, 8 or 10 years ago and has become national in scope. They have a terrific program using mentors in how to take people who don't have the skills and teach them the skills to start their own businesses. There's huge opportunity if we can actually focus on helping and assisting the 40% while not ignoring the 60%. And that's my theme. That's one. My purpose here is to getting you to think two things. One, we're doing really well. If you look at we're instead of being down on ourselves as we are so often, if you look at the progress over the last decade, you'll find we've made phenomenal progress. And the next decade holds more promise than the past decade ever did. Thank you.